So over these last several weeks, we have been looking at the ways the early church grew and looking at those ways that they grew and asking the question, can we perhaps now in our life and in our church today recognize ways that we can model what that early church did so that we can begin to grow as that early church grew so rapidly in the first century. Now, we started with this idea of the way the church began through the gift of the Holy Spirit was to respond to the message of Jesus. And then we looked at the ways in which fellowship brought that church together. And then after that, we looked at how when the church was challenged by the possibility of divisions, they found ways throughout their leadership and their vision to move beyond those challenges and respond to those needs that were being expressed, not by ignoring them, not by pretending they weren't there, by really embracing that change. Then we looked at how when persecution began to come into the church, that did not stop them. They were not cowering back, but they still went out to new places and began to share the gospel. So we see all those places where the church grew. And it's interesting because if you look at the book of Acts, it always talks about how, and then God added more to their number. So there's one other place where we see this happening. And what's interesting about this is the context in which this new change happens in the midst of much resistance from the early church. You see, the fact is, when the early church began, it began as a movement within Judaism. So it began as Jews beginning to see that Jesus was the Messiah. But it had not made that big leap to include the Gentiles. Now, for you and I, in our world, we don't think of the world as divided between Jews and Gentiles, right? I mean, we don't think of it that way. But we need to recognize there are divisions, right? There are divisions within our world, and there are some that we probably look at within our culture and we say, these are the good people that are acceptable in the community of the church, and these are the people that are on the other side of the barrier. Now, again, for this early church, that barrier was the barrier between Jews and Gentiles. What's that barrier for you? What is the barrier that says, no, we can't cross over and invite that kind of person, that type of person, to be a part of our community? As you're thinking about that, recognize that this is what happened in the church. The barrier between Jew and Gentile was too great. And there was this huge pushback from the early church to not open up the church to the Gentiles. If the Gentile was going to become a part of the community, they had to adhere to everything that a Jew was adhering to in order to be acceptable. Well, they did not want that to change. And so you know what? The Holy Spirit changed it for them, because the Holy Spirit was uncontainable. It happened this way. Peter saw this vision of these animals that were lowered down from heaven, and a voice said, take and eat. And Peter saw this as a challenge, as a temptation. And he was saying, no way. That is representation of something that's not a part of our community as Jews. And the voice said, do not consider unclean what God has made clean. Right after that, Peter is invited to follow some men to the home of a Gentile by the name of Cornelius. And again, Peter saw that barrier. He didn't even want to go into his house. But once he took that step and went into Cornelius's house and began to tell the story of Jesus, the next thing you know, the Holy Spirit comes down and it rests on not only Cornelius, but his whole family. I mean, think about what's going on there. Peter's going, no, there's a wall here. And the Holy Spirit says, no, I'm going to cross that wall. Come, join me. When Peter does that, and this big change is beginning to happen, he goes back to the home church in Jerusalem, and they are furious. They can't understand why he has done this. And Peter tries to say, it's not me. It is not me. It was the Holy Spirit. Still, the church is struggling with it. And there's a story of how during this time of scattering, some people went to this area of Antioch And as they go, they begin to speak the message. They begin to tell the story of Jesus. But it's really interesting because in Acts chapter 11, verse 19, it says they share the story of Jesus with no one except the Jews. They still keep it in-house. But then it says that there were some men from a Gentile region who were coming into Antioch, and they were beginning to share not just with the Jews, but they were beginning to share with some of those who were Greek. They began to share with some of the Gentiles. And then it says, as this was happening in verse 21 of chapter 11, the hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number of believers turned to the Lord. You know, when that happened, the message came back to Jerusalem. They couldn't believe it. They couldn't imagine that God's Spirit would cross over those boundaries. They sent Barnabas to check it out, and Barnabas was amazed at what he saw because the Spirit continued to push them. And I think sometimes in our day and age and in our world, that Spirit's beginning to push us. Some of those boundaries that used to be so clear for us, now we're being pushed. And God is opening up the church in a new way. And just as once that happened with the Gentiles, you see the hand of the Lord was on them, and the church began to grow. I think the same thing's going on today. Are we ready? Are we ready for a spirit that cannot be contained? Are we ready to embrace a spirit that sends us to people and to places that used to be on the other side of that boundary? That's what God may be calling us to today. And we need to open our hearts and our minds to what God is calling us to do today.